to vote easily. And in almost every other advanced democracy in the world, even people, not just people who have finished serving their sentences, but people who are still incarcerated have the ability to vote. The South African Constitutional Court required it in South Africa. The Canadian Supreme Court required it in Canada. In Germany, they view it as part of the rehabilitation of prisoners. In Israel, the guy who assassinated Rabin is still entitled to vote while he's in jail. So, you know, the United States is really an outlier here, and it's an outlier here because of racism in the criminal justice system. And if it weren't for that, we would have gotten rid of felon disenfranchisement long ago. Here is a stunning statistic for all of you that I calculated by looking at the 1870 census. I calculated how many African-American men there were in the United States in 1870, because that's the group of people who were enfranchised by the 14th and 15th Amendment, since women couldn't vote. There were more black men who were disenfranchised by offender disenfranchisement in 2000 than were enfranchised by the 15th Amendment in 1870, right? And here's another statistic that's stunning, but shows that if we had the political will to do what Rick is talking about, we could do it, which is, there's a part of the Voting Rights Act nobody talks about anymore, which was Section 6 of the Voting Rights Act. It appointed federal examiners in the South, federal civil servants, to go and register people in the counties that were the most recalcitrant. And in the 2 years after Section 6 was enacted, the federal government registered more African Americans in the South than had been registered in the previous 70 years. So if you have the political will, the technology enables you to register everybody to vote. And we should expand the voting period so it's not just on a Tuesday between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., which is difficult for people who have lives on the margin, but it should be a 2-week period, including weekends, including nights. And if you did that, that would increase the number of voters dramatically. So I don't think that we need preclearance for the first generation problems. I think those problems could be solved if we had the political will. The second generation is where I think you need something like preclearance, because otherwise the cost and the difficulty of litigating these cases through to a final judgment is prohibitive. And you just can't attack those kinds of gerrymanders that dilute, either intentionally or unintentionally, the voting strength of racial minorities through litigation brought by the very few organizations that are committed to this full time, especially when you have a Justice Department that's completely not committed. And that's one of the things to understand about preclearance, is it goes through the Justice Department. So if you have a Justice Department like our current one, which is headed by a man who was too racist because of his attempts to suppress black voting strength to be named a federal judge in 1986, preclearance is not going to save you.
Charles.
So I agree with all that's been said. A couple more things, though. I do think that on the issue of felon disenfranchisement, you know, I think that it would be interesting if we were thinking ambitiously to think about what those fixes could be. You know, Pam referred earlier to, you know, racism in the criminal justice system. The idea that you can hide behind this, you know, constitutional provision in the 14th Amendment that allows you to disenfranchise ex-offenders while maintaining a criminal justice system that is rife with racism of the sort described in the previous panel seems to me to be, you know, a constitutional sleight of hand that simply should not be permissible. And so it seems to me you could, in this new expanded Voting Rights Act that included a national preclearance provision of the kind that Dabo talked about, that included universal registration of the kind that Rick talked about, that maybe included automatic registration for everyone 18 years old or above, that included the kind of expanded voting time that Pam talked about, certainly if not 2 weeks, certainly we could do 2 days, we could do a weekend, that it could also include a provision that described the circumstances in which you cannot disenfranchise ex-offenders, and that is if the criminal justice system is determined to have several markers or factors that demonstrate that the existence of racism in the criminal justice system, then you are not allowed to use the ex-offender status of individuals to keep them from voting. And you might create a kind of jingles test, a kind of set of factors that would determine whether a criminal justice system in a particular state or jurisdiction had the effect of disenfranchising disproportionately African Americans because of the presence of racism as an objective factor. I think beginning to think about what this means when you allow racism in one area to bleed into another area. This is precisely, in fact, what the Voting Rights Act was meant to deal with. You know, the genius of the Voting Rights Act is that it did anticipate the future. Debo was talking about this earlier, the tension between the progress of the past and recognizing that there's still work to be done. By its very terms, that's what the Voting Rights Act was meant to do. When you read the Senate report that accompanied the Voting Rights Act, in which Congress was clear that they wanted to get at not only methods of disenfranchising African Americans that existed in 1965, but they wanted to get at what they described as those ingenious methods that they couldn't even think of yet. They recognized that in the future there would be new ways of disenfranchising African Americans, and the whole preclearance process was created to capture what might happen in the future that they couldn't anticipate in the moment. So I think when we think about a kind of renewed Voting Rights Act, that's how we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking about an act that leaves enough room for the recognition of what I described before, the ongoing reality of racism and racial manipulation. I think Rick was talking about the ways in which race has been kind of deployed by the political parties, first by the Democrats and now by the Republicans, as a way of controlling the electorate. And I think that that's a reality. That's not a theory. And so that has to somehow be factored into, I think, any recrafted legislation that attempts to seriously engage the question of racial discrimination in voting. And I just say, as a last point, it requires first an acknowledgement of the core anti-democratic nature of racism in voting, right? Pam referenced the voter ID case in Texas. We know about the voter suppression law in North Carolina. These are two laws that have been found by federal courts, federal appellate courts, to be discriminatory. In the case of the North Carolina court, it was the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals that found that the voter suppression law that ended souls to the polls and so forth was created with surgical precision to discriminate against African American voters. In Texas, the trial court found that the Texas voter ID law was created for the purpose of discriminating against African American and Latino voters. Now, we've had lots of conversations over the last year after post-Charlottesville about white supremacy in this country. But I think when we have the legislatures of two states that have been found, not by the nice people on this panel, but by federal courts to have met and converged and deliberately passed laws for the purpose of disenfranchising minority voters, we have a democracy problem. And it's that kind of recognition that produced the original Voting Rights Act, that when they stopped judgment at Nuremberg and people saw what was happening on that Edmund Pettus Bridge, people saw we had a democracy problem. And what's interesting to me is, though, that despite the fact that we have these two federal court decisions, and many others, by the way, despite the fact that Texas hasn't had one redistricting since the 1970s that hasn't been found to be racially discriminatory, despite that fact, we don't see this as a core democracy problem for the nation. Because if we did, Congress would be at the table trying to figure out how do we solve this democracy problem. And I'll say that I think the urgency of seeing it as a democracy problem, I'm giving you a segue here, is reflected by what we saw with the manipulation of race by Russian operatives in the election in 2016. That even foreign governments know about our race problem and know that you can manipulate race in elections. And so I've been describing racism in our election system as a national security vulnerability, that like anybody can see it and manipulate it. So I think that we do have to turn to seeing this as a democracy problem, and any legislation that we can create in this mythical future when we have a Congress that has the courage, the spine, the willingness, and the patriotism to do so has to see it in that framework, that they are resolving not a problem of just Texas or this county, but a democracy problem for this country.
Thank you, Sherilyn. Thank you. So far, everything we've been talking about has been focused on the federal level, and to the extent we've referred to state action, it's been in the negative. Some of the voter ID stuff that states have done, some of the citizenship requirements for registration and so forth. Are there any developments on the state level that you would describe as positive in terms of election reform, voting reform?
Sure. So, I mean, this is one of the problems, and this is the Civil War continuing to today. As you look at the Union states, and a number of them have done some bad things, but a number of them have done terrific things. So, you know, in California and in Oregon, the secretaries of state are moving towards automatic voter registration, so that people will automatically be registered, and that cuts down on difficulties. They've made it easier for people to vote by mail if they want to vote by mail. Oregon sends trucks in its vote by mail to senior citizen centers to help senior citizens vote and like. So that's one thing that you see some states doing that I think is a lot better. We've actually done much better on the legislative level than on the judicial level in offender disenfranchisement. A number of states have moved away from lifetime felon disenfranchisement. There are only 2 states that allow people who are currently incarcerated to vote, but a majority of states now allow people who have finished serving their sentences to vote, and that makes a huge difference for a lot of people. And some of those states just automatically re-enfranchise people after they've finished their sentences. So it's not like nothing can be done, and there are some state and local election administrators who make major efforts to see that the machines work properly and that the poll workers are trained. Right before I went to give a talk last June, I had to vote absentee for the first time in a long time. Although California allows you to vote absentee automatically, I like to go to the polls because I actually think there's something important about standing in line with other people. It's disgraceful if you have to do it for more than about 20 minutes, but there's something deeply important about citizenship and casting a ballot as part of your public citizenship, as opposed to doing it at home where you start to think about it more as a private activity. But when I went to the polling place, there was a Chinese American woman who was ahead of me in line, and she was having trouble, and the poll worker came over to her and said, "We have ballots in Chinese. I'll give you the ballot in Chinese. Let's just tear that up and start over with a new one." So there are people who do a conscientious job of this. It's not as if it's a bleak thing across the country. The problem is that in the places where African Americans and Latinos vote, especially in places where they're an increasing share of the population, it's no surprise why Texas is doing what it's doing. Texas is the first state in the country to become a majority-minority state other than Hawaii. But first state in the continental United States, and it's no secret that part of the reason they're doing what they're doing is to decrease the share of the electorate that's African American and even more so Latino. So it matters where you are in the country to whether you have an election system that says count every vote, or you have an election system that says count some people's votes and not others.
If I could just add to this idea of what I've called red state election law and blue state election law. The problem is, this goes back to my earlier point about Congress's power, although Congress has the power to make uniformity in elections, our general view is a federalist view that it's not only that we don't have a federal election, we don't even have state elections, we have local elections, right? So when we conduct the presidential election, it's like 10,000 separate elections. And so there's a tremendous, when there are no uniform federal rules, there's a tremendous amount of discretion, especially local discretion. And without Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act to make sure that last-minute changes are not happening, things are flying under the radar. Things are happening in places that we don't even know about until it's too late. And so federalism has a lot of virtues. Even in the election area, it has the virtue that if there's hacking of machines, it's not going to affect us nationally. But I do think this is an area where it shouldn't be that if you live in California, it's really easy to vote and everyone's enfranchised, but if you live in Texas, you might have to travel 250 miles to get your free voter ID if you live in a rural area. So it's just, it's not a way to have equal dignity of citizenship across the United States.
I'll let Sherilyn and Debo speak to this last question in a moment, but at this point I would like to start moving towards questions from the audience. So if those of you who have questions from the audience, please come up to the 2 microphones. I'd like to sort of alternate between the the person who's at the front microphone and the person who's at the rear microphone. And because of the lights, I can't see the rear microphone. So it's an honor system, so please just try to help self-regulate here if you don't mind. And we'll let our other panelists finish on that last question if you want to.
So on this question about what the states are doing, I think it's a very interesting and important question. When we learn about our system of government, we talk about the states as laboratories in our democracy. And we've seen a lot of retrograde measures. We've spoken about some of them and where they're happening. And I think that there were many states that for a long time were asleep at the switch, meaning folks were so focused on the efforts to narrow the electorate and to prevent people from voting that there weren't enough states that were leaning forward to say, what is it we can do to expand democracy? And I think it happens for a couple of reasons. There's this thing that undergirds so much of the discussions about voting in America, which is this concept about whether you envision voting as a privilege or as a right. And I think there are many people who view it as a privilege that has to be earned. And if you look at the history of our registration and our inclusion and who could vote over time, we jealously guarded the right to vote. We have very jealously, as Americans, guarded the right to vote. Pam spoke to this a bit. But over time, groups have been added, often through constitutional amendment. And these additions of people coming into the electorate have often occurred after wartime. That is to say that we have gone to export democracy or talk about defending freedoms overseas, and young people have died for this. And then they come back and they're asking the questions about what kind of democracy we have at home. Alexander Kesar wrote a great book that charts the extent to which voting progress has happened after wartime, when the country has had to look inward and talk about moving forward. Now, we've been in an extended period of war, and we've seen the ebbs and flows, but now we're hearing about these states. Oregon, Washington State, a couple of weeks ago, passed an automatic voter registration and a pre-registration for young people, where high school students who are 17 or so can pre-register and take the necessary steps such that when they become 18 and eligible to vote, they will be on the rolls. Now, registration is important, but that's a first step. You also have to get people out to the polls, right? Because lots of people register and don't go. But what they found in Oregon, looking back at the automatic voter registration, is that many of those people who were automatically registered did vote. And there were some studies done to look at who are these people who were registered, and they tended to be younger, more rural, lower income, and to some extent diverse, to the extent that happens in Oregon. And so, I think these are important things, but undergirding the choice about whether you're trying to open up the democracy or close it off is this concept of, are you thinking about it as a privilege or a right? And also, are you committing to the idea that in a democracy, we are choosing risk? We are choosing the risk that our people won't be elected and that sometimes somebody else is going to win. And part of what you see in these voting battles are that people are not willing to accept the risk that democracy imposes upon us, that people should have an opportunity to come forward and choose, and your side is not always going to win. Many of the things we've talked about are efforts to put your thumb on the scale to control the outcome or to exclude a certain segment that you think may not be aligned. And I want to live in a democracy where we're prepared to let people vote and let the chips fall.
Just a couple of things. So 51% of black people still live in the South. And so when we begin to talk about the progress that's happening, we're usually, as Pam suggested, talking about somewhere along the coast. And so we're still not getting at the core of the issue of race and voting. And I think we have to be clear-eyed about that to recognize the challenge that we face. I think we also have to recognize that, as has been alluded to, we're not actually just talking about at the state level, we're talking about at the local level. This is something that I learned my first tour of duty as a young legal defense fund lawyer, and Pam knows this well, that much of the litigation that I participated in involved local elections, involved, you know, the school board and the town council and constables and justices of the peace. And what I learned was that these were the offices that really controlled the lives of the people who we were representing in many of the communities where we worked. And one of the reasons why it's very difficult to solve problems at the local level is that this country's entire conversation about voting is really focused on first the national and second on the two political parties. And so everything is seen through that lens. And that makes it very difficult to have real conversations about the kind of thing that Debo was just talking about really the conception of what role voting plays in our society. We saw this last year with the special election, Senate election in Alabama. Now, LDF does a lot of its voting rights work in Alabama. We're currently challenging Alabama's voter ID law. We're in Alabama every election day doing poll watching. That's where I did poll watching in November 2016. You know, everyone said, why aren't you in a swing state? Because I run a nonpartisan organization, because I'm actually old enough to remember when we still sued Democrats in voting rights cases also. And so I spent November 2016 in Alabama, and I know what I saw on election day in November 2016. Now, nobody cared about it because that wasn't a swing state. Last year, in the special Senate election, people cared about it a lot because now this was a national election. It involved the balance between Democrats and Republicans in the United States Senate, and suddenly everyone was in Alabama, and they were seeing the things that we were seeing. We spent the day there, and we saw all the things that Pam was alluding to about people showing up and not being told that they were in the wrong line, and being told that they could, cast provisional ballots rather than regular ballots, the wrong voting machines turning up at African-American precincts. All of this. I was put off of a precinct in November 2016, literally told that I had to leave, and after weighing it for a minute, I decided they were serious and that I should go. But this is real, and this is happening at the local level. So I think turning our attention away from thinking about politics, voting, participation, and democracy as just being a national matter, and remembering that it functions most effectively, most powerfully, and often most disastrously at the local level, and beginning to turn our attention to that is really important. Now here I do see some progress. I think the election of some of these progressive prosecutors is one of those things that's not just been limited to the coast, right? That the election of the first black DA in Florida, Aramis Ayala, who immediately then ran into a third-generation voting problem when she decided not to pursue the death penalty in a number of cases and was challenged by the governor. The election of a black DA in Alabama. I mean, I think we're beginning to see some of that transformation happening. But I do think that to the extent we're not focusing our attention on the local, it's vitally important. And then just because this is a panel about Dr. King's vision, I would be remiss if I didn't say, as it relates to those local elections, we also have a responsibility as well. And this is not just about the apparatus that's designed to keep us from participating fully in the political process. We have to actually believe that those elections matter. We actually have to vote in school board. I mean, I know when you go to the polls, you're going to vote for the president and the governor and the senator, right? And maybe the mayor. But are you voting in the school board election? I mean, every one of us has faced a judicial election in which it says pick three, and we actually don't even know who the three are. Maybe we know one of them, but we pick three based on political party or whatever else we think. We haven't really taken the time to educate ourselves about who those judges are. We haven't taken the time to educate ourselves about who those DA candidates are. We haven't taken the time to educate ourselves. I mean, here I've heard the name Sheriff Arpaio this morning, right? We all know Sheriff Bull Connor, right? We know Sheriff David Clark. Sheriffs run for election. And to the extent you're not paying attention to those sheriff's elections, you're not educating yourself about who those candidates are, and then you're not voting in those elections. I mean, to me, this is like so beyond even thinking about like what you're doing in the presidential election, because this person is patrolling your community with police power, and then we want to talk about, inequities in the criminal justice system. So I do think that it would be remiss of me not to talk about the fact that Dr. King also recognized our role. His presumption in Give Us the Ballot is that we would exercise that ballot responsibly, that we would educate ourselves, that we would recognize that every election counted. When he talks about all of the elections, he goes from the top to the bottom. And the question is, do we do that? So I do hope we'll leave this conference with a renewed sense that even as many of us are fighting these structural impediments to voting, there is a role for us to play in terms of really paying attention to those local elections and paying attention to what our role can be in tipping the balance in many of those races.
Thank you very much, and we'll go to our first question up front here.
I want to thank all the panelists, first of all, for an excellent discussion. When Professor Carlin was talking about first, second, and third order questions, and Ms. Eiffel mentioned the democracy problem, made me think about an issue that's been in the news recently that y'all didn't bring up, which is the citizenship question on the census. And interested, first of all, Professor Carlin, do you think that's a second order question or an antecedent question? I think that's just kind of an interesting conceptual matter. And also, I saw a panel on Fox News Sunday yesterday where they were talking about this, and no one mentioned Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, where you have to count the whole number of persons. And Jason Chaffetz, formerly a member of Congress, said he was shocked that he was elected by people that were counted more than just citizens. And I'd like y'all's reaction to that. Thank you.
Okay, great question.
So if there's anybody who hasn't been following this, the Trump administration has proposed putting a question on the census that's going to be conducted in 2020 that would ask people about their citizenship status. And there are a couple of problems or issues that arise out of this. The first one is that putting a question on the census that asks people about their citizenship makes it less likely that a number of people will answer the census at all. And we already know that there's a serious undercount in communities of color. That is, the census doesn't capture all of them. That's a problem because a couple of things that are very important flow from the census. The two most important ones are the allocation of seats in the United States House of Representatives. And as you alluded to, the Constitution says those seats are supposed to be allocated based on the number of inhabitants, not on the number of citizens in each state. But the second thing that flows from this is a huge amount of federal money that goes back to the states is given to the states based on their population. So if your state's population isn't accurately counted, your state gets less money in block grants for education and health care and transportation from the federal government. So the first problem with the census question is it's going to lead to an undercount. That undercount is not going to be random. It's going to be more of an undercount among African Americans and even more so an undercount among Latinos, and that's going to reduce the political power of the states in which they reside. The second problem comes from how, having gotten these seats in Congress, how you redistrict, how you reapportion your seats within the state, and how you also set up state legislative seats, city council seats, county commission seats, and the like. Because what people are worried about is not just the undercount here, but the fact that some states will be inclined to use citizenship numbers rather than population numbers to allocate the seats they're given for Congress or to allocate seats in their state legislatures and the like. And this is going to lead to a dramatic underrepresentation of Latinos and a slightly smaller but not insignificant underrepresentation of African Americans. That's mostly going to be about Latinos, though. And the important thing there is it's a third-generation issue, because if those people aren't electing, if those communities aren't electing people to the legislature, they're not going to be at the bargaining table, and they're not going to be at the bargaining table in the same numbers as they would otherwise be.
Anybody else want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just want to say very quickly that it is also, well, let me say two things. First of all, it matters that the intention of this is to do all of the things that Pam just described. That's a democracy problem, right? That notwithstanding the very words of the Constitution, that there is a deliberate attempt to do precisely what Pam described, just to ensure that there is an undercount and to produce all of the collateral consequences that she described. But I do want to say this is also a matter of governance and services. If I'm the mayor of a town and I need to allocate, sanitation services, if I need to think about where we allow housing to develop and so forth within the community, I want to know who lives there, because I still have to serve those people. If I want to determine whether or not we need a bigger high school or we need a bigger elementary school, I still have to serve that population, whether they are citizen or non-citizen. And so I would want that accurate information. But to allow, in fact, to encourage a kind of public policy that deliberately ignores the needs of the non-citizen population is cynical indeed, but is in fact quite deliberate. And I don't think this is any speculation. I actually my first job as an adult was as a census enumerator with the little bag that was slung across me when I was 18 years old in 1980, do the math. So anyway, the point is, and I know what it took. This is, and one of the great things about being a census enumerator is that you learn about communities, in this case, my own community, and to learn what it takes actually to get people to talk to you, and to see all of the reasons why people don't want to talk to you, and who you have to be to have people open that door and answer the questions of how many people live in that home and so forth. This really is a matter of delicacy and balance. And there is no question that including a question like that will make some people not open that door because their cousin is undocumented and has been staying with them. They themselves are fully legal, right? But because and if you combine it, you can't divorce this decision from what everyone has seen happening with these ICE raids. If you have seen it, if you have seen families torn apart, if you have seen fathers and mothers have to leave their children, then answer the question, would you open the door if you knew that an undocumented cousin or an undocumented aunt or even friend of the family was staying with you? If you had witnessed that kind of tragedy. So you have to put these things together and understand that this is quite deliberate. And this is what I mean when I say we can look at all of these things seriatim, but I think it would behoove us at this moment, and this is the way that Dr. King thought when he thought about the sickness of the nation, to recognize that we have a democracy problem. We don't just have a political party problem or a voting problem in a particular place, that each of these things is a reflection on the strength, the health, and the vitality of our democracy nationally.
Thank you. We're going to go for another 10 minutes before we break. We're going to try to get through as many questions as we can. I apologize in advance. We probably won't get to all the questions that we have. If we could go to the next person in the back.
Hi. I have, I guess it's sort of an observation / comment I'm hoping you might respond to. And it connects the first panel up to this one. I noticed, I was struck by that many of you on the panel were using the word racism very directly and saying that these problems are a problem of racism, which I agree with. But I found it an interesting contrast with the first panel where there was much more discussion of implicit bias and less of a direct calling out of using terms like racism for a variety of reasons. And implicit bias is a real thing, it's a real problem, it's a real concern. But I also find that if we, to the extent we start using implicit bias as this sort of way to explain what most of race relations is about in this country today, it's a more comfortable way of talking about racism, that it also allows us to sort of consign explicit racism to the past or to just to tiki torch Nazis and nothing else. And in many ways, that the rise of the talk or focus on implicit bias, I think, has enabled a decision like Roberts in the Holder case in Shelby County that sort of dismisses the past, right, and say racism isn't an issue, things have changed. And one way we do that is by saying, oh, well, there's implicit bias, but racism is really a thing of the past. And so I'm just wondering how you might sort of think about the relationship between racism and implicit bias in the work you're doing.
Maybe I'll start. So obviously both are important, and I think one way to consider your question is to think about what is the impact of whether it's racism or implicit bias on the person that is receiving the downside of the view, of the treatment, of the decision, right? In both cases, it's having an effect of narrowing opportunity, sometimes of risking somebody's life, of narrowing full enjoyment of citizenship. And so my view is that it's bad no matter how it's happening, and it may require different ways to get at it if it's implicit bias, and so it's less upfront and in your face. But the other piece of it comes from the history. And the history is that over time, because of the civil rights revolution and all of our history, people have come to understand that you can't always achieve discriminatory ends in the same way that you used to be able to do it and stand out on the courthouse steps and say, you know, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That won't work in most cases today. And so there are federal court decisions that talk about how would-be discriminators have become sophisticated over time and try to cloak their intent. They don't make it manifest. Now, we still see cases where it is manifest. Sherilyn mentioned some of them, and courts are willing to call it where they see it. But that's a reason why in the civil rights litigation, the effects standards, the results standards that try and ferret out inexplainable disparities, the disparities that are not explainable through rational discourse, and try to get at them through a results test or an effects test are so important, as well as the intent cases. Now, the thing that I'll say finally about the intent cases is that it's very hard to have people call other people racist because people feel it's difficult, it can be isolating and all of that. Sometimes you need to call it where you see it, but it's hard for courts to issue a ruling that adjudicates a legislative body or a law enforcement officer or a teacher or anybody else as being racist. And so these different tools in the law are in part a response to the difficulty that some people have of calling things what they are. And I think we shouldn't lose sight that regardless of how discrimination is being visited, whether it's consciously or not, it still has a negative impact that should be answerable in our laws.
I'm thinking of, there was a Simpsons episode where there was a banner flying. It said, Fox News, not racist, but #1 with racists. And it goes back to this issue of racially polarized voting that I mentioned earlier. We know that, especially in the South, whites and African Americans tend to vote for different candidates. And even if you just look at Democrats, so you look at Clinton versus Obama in 2008, same thing is true. And so the parties have found a way, and lately it's been the Republican Party has found a way to harness white racism in order to achieve political ends. And this a kind of intersection between between partisanship and race in terms of motivations makes it really hard for the courts to deal with the problem. But whether you deal with it one way or the other, it's a real phenomenon that the courts need to take cognizance of.
I'm afraid, just 1 second, Pam. I'm afraid we'll have time for only one more question, so we'll take the question of the person up front. If you want to speak to that other point, please go ahead.
Okay, so I was just going to say, you know, there was a tremendous victory last year at the Supreme Court that Sherilyn was part of in a case that involved such overt racism, the Buck case, you know, such overt racism that even the Supreme Court couldn't deny it was there. But I think what happens with cases like that is it allows the conservative justices to tell themselves they're against racism because look what they did when there's a case of complete racism in which a man was sentenced to death because there was testimony at his trial that black people are more dangerous than white people, right? And so that allows the Supreme Court to tell themselves, well, we still care about racial justice, but then they don't see the problem when it's the vast majority of cases today that don't involve overt express discussions of racism. And I think, and this is an important point that Debo made as well, it's important to say there's not just explicit bias and implicit bias, there's also the legacy of hundreds of years of past discrimination that even people who have no bias at all engage in. So if you have a requirement for a job that there be a college degree, you might not have that because you're trying to keep black people out. You might not even have that because implicitly you're trying to keep black people out. But if because of our educational system fewer black people have the opportunity to get a college degree, that's discriminatory and we need to do something about that. And that it's that last category that I think we really should be especially focused on because lots of people think that's not a problem at all. That we declared victory and went home. And Roy Austin's friend, Jeff Sessions, has announced, he's finally seen the light. And that's a terrible, terrible problem that we haven't really confronted directly.
I told you you'd have the last question. If you could keep it brief, and panelists, we could keep it brief as well. Well, this will be our last question.
Steve, I'm a warrior too. We can't be brief. I want to thank Debo for introducing, first of all, the panel was outstanding. Thank you for a very complex subject. Y'all really did a good job. I want to thank Debo for introducing the subject of war into this complicated discussion to make it even more complex. I was a trial attorney with the Civil Rights Division on August the 8th, 1965, when President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. And one of the proudest moments in my life was when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, because there was a direct relationship between that act and his election. And when he placed the Medal of Honor, the Presidential Medal of Honor, on John Doerr's neck and said, I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for John Doerr, he could have dropped out probably and just said, I wouldn't have been here. So it was a really extraordinarily important and almost radical piece of legislation, radical in the positive sense. But, you know, with all of this, if you have these damn wars, and Dr. King saw that. Dr. King was a prophet. He saw that. And that's why he spoke out about it and was willing to risk the whole movement because of it. So this whole subject just covers all of this stuff, this subject of our nation going to the war. I mean, Vietnam, clearly horrible mistake. In the invasion of Iraq, you know, 20 years later, we're still magged down in a problem that's not ours. We're out there creating problems. This is what we're doing as a nation. We're the Roman Empire. And when you read history, something happened to that empire. And so I'll leave you with that and get you some
Okay,
thoughts.
all right. Thank you very much. Any comments to that? Any responses to the comments? Okay, before we break, I wanted... Oh, sure, please, yeah.
Only that in the last year of his life, Dr. King was very clear about the three evils, right? Racism, poverty, and militarism. And he, you know, although he got a lot of pushback, including from the civil rights community about addressing the issue of militarism, he said he would not pretend that these three things were not intertwined. And he would not be silent about any of them, and that he thought it was important to talk about them. And so I appreciate that comment. I also think that it is really vitally important, and I really want to just address this to the prior question as well, that we be unafraid at this point, 50 years after the assassination of Dr. King, to talk explicitly about racism and the way in which racism is a cancer eating away at our democracy and always has been. And that we not be afraid to talk about it, that we not be afraid to talk about it being explicit or implicit or legacy, but that we recognize that it remains with us and we recognize the danger of it. And for that reason, I think actually it's important to talk about implicit bias, because implicit bias is meant to address the reasons why good-meaning people will tolerate the explicit bias of others. Right? It's why in terms of the first panel, it's why, despite the fact that there may be explicit bias happening in some of these cases of shootings and so forth, why good-meaning people are willing to allow it, are willing to give it a pass. And that it's important. It's an important thing for people to recognize the role that that can play. But explicit bias is back on the stage, actually, in full effect. You know, we sued the president this past year about this election commission. And we sued him on the grounds that it was intentionally designed to discriminate against minority voters, against African American and Latino voters. We weren't ashamed to say that. I think it is a shame that is true of a president of this country, that president can be engaged in explicitly racially discriminatory rhetoric, comments, and actions. I think that's a shame, but I think we do have to call that what it is. Doesn't mean implicit bias doesn't exist, but it does mean, and we'll never know what happened with that case. Obviously, the commission had to be disbanded. But I think it's important in this moment to recognize that explicit bias is fully back on the table. That's what I meant when I was talking about the cases. That's what I meant when I was talking about the decision about the census and the citizenship question. These are explicit actions designed to suppress a part of the population that is racial minorities. And the fact that we are here today for this anniversary means we have to talk about it. We have to talk about the fact that that is still stubbornly with us and that it still threatens to corrode our democracy.
Thank you. Thank you. If I could, two things before we break. The first is I want us all to thank our great panel. And the second is a program announcement I've been asked to make. So the next panel will continue at 2:15 back in this room. And if you are pre-registered for the luncheon, then you should go now to the grand ballroom. You can go out that door and turn right, and then people will guide you to the grand ballroom. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. Great comments. Thank you.
We're living in a world where trust matters. Not just trust in the news and information we receive, but trust in who gives it to us. Media outlets are coming under vicious attack, often by politicians angry about being held accountable. Donald Trump rails on and on about fake news, even though he readily dishes it out and lies on a frequent basis. In addition, we watch and consume cable, broadcast, and digital news and see the appalling lack of diversity and inclusion, which easily shows up in the stories we don't hear about, stories we know matter. Personally, it has been tough to watch TV news over the last 6 months since the cancellation of my daily morning news show. Not because I'm not interested, but because of what isn't being discussed and who isn't being heard and what is happening and how it affects not just those on Main Street, but also on MLK Street. Last week, the political world was stunned when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a 28-year-old first-time candidate, beat longtime Democratic incumbent Joe Crowley in the New York congressional primary. Her campaign was ignored by traditional media outlets who just assumed the powerful Crowley would coast to victory. That's simply media laziness and taking the public for granted. We see that all too often. We saw it last year when traditional news outlets rushed to interview black women who hit the ground hard to elect Doug Jones to the U.S. Senate in Alabama. But how many of those same outlets would have interviewed those sisters before the election? They were struggling to have their voices heard and getting their message out to raise money to fund their endeavors on the ground. Now, I talked to them on the Tom Joyner Morning Show and TV One, but here we are today, just a few months out from the midterm elections. And where will DeWanna Thompsons and Adriana Shropshires and Latasha Browns and Stephanie James and Melanie Campbells and Rosa Clementes, where will they go to raise their voices before the election? What about the awesome work being done by many of our civil rights groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law? We need to hear from them daily regarding the vital work they are doing to counter the shameful efforts to deny us the right to vote. They're filing critical lawsuits. Unfortunately, they don't get as much media attention. Reverend Dr. William Barber and others are picking up the mantle of Dr. King and the Poor People's Campaign, and mainstream media is essentially ignoring the massive mobilization and direct actions nationwide. Here you have a broad coalition of folks from different races and religions fighting for the people, but mainstream media doesn't care to highlight their concerns as well as the campaign. Now look, I can go on, but you get the picture. Over the last 6 months, so many of you have stopped me in airports, train stations, on the streets, in barbershops, and at numerous events to tell me you missed TV One's News One Now and what we did every morning for 4 years mattered. I've had millennials, Gen Xers, baby boomers, preachers, teachers, CEOs, entertainers, sports figures, men and women, some in tears, tell me how much they learn each day and how vital it was to start their mornings with news and information for us and by us. That's why I'm proud, excited, and humbled today to announce that on September 4th, I will launch a daily digital show that will give a voice to the voiceless and speak truth to power on the issues of the day. This is Roland Martin, Unfiltered.
He's got it. Whatever the biz, he's on it. Whatever it is, he's got the scoop, the fact, the find. And when it breaks, he's right on time and it's rolling. Best believe he's knowing. Putting it down from sports to news to politics. With entertainment just for kicks, he's rolling. It's on go, y'all. It's Roland Martin, yeah. Rolling with Roland now. He's funk, he's fresh, he's real, the best, you know he's Roland Martin now. Martin!
Pretty cool, huh? And those voices in that song may sound familiar. That is Terry Ellis and Cindy Heron of En Vogue. That song was produced by Slick, and I'm proud to have their support. Folks, Roland Martin Unfiltered will be a daily show broadcast from Washington, D.C. and will focus on news, politics, culture, entertainment, social justice, sports, education, business, and finance. If it's important to you, we'll cover it. You'll be treated to some of the top minds in education, public policy, and academia, discussing the news of the day and why it matters to us. We will also hit the road and broadcast from cities across America, holding town halls and forums to hear what the people, not just the DC pundits, have to say. You will see one-on-one interviews with authors, artists, and other top names going deep to get at what matters to us. We will also do something different. You won't just see it once a day. We will stream the show live and then restream it several times over a 24-hour period and make it available for video on demand. In addition, we will offer a video and audio podcast of the show. And we are in discussions with several TV stations across the country who want to air it in select markets. But folks, there's more. Roland Martin Unfiltered will also live stream speeches, summits, conferences, and other events to our audience. There are a number of things happening every day across America that mainstream media simply ignores. But because of today's technology, we will be able to bring you these events unfiltered. You can also expect to see and participate in these live events across the country, such as our town halls, one-on-one interviews, as well as pop-up events. My team has done this for the past 6 months as we have broadcast speeches, lectures, and rallies from all across the country, even major events such as Operations Hope Global Hope Forum, the 50th anniversary commemoration of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, and weekly demonstrations of the Poor People's Campaign. In July, we will broadcast live from Essence Festival in New Orleans, the NAACP National Convention in San Antonio, as well as the Jeffrey Osborne Celebrity Classic in Connecticut. Folks, this will truly be a digital experience like no other. And the great thing about Roland Martin Unfiltered, everything will be interactive. You will get to comment in real time and share your thoughts and views. And in fact, we will incorporate your videos as you talk about what is happening, the news of the day. Roland Martin Unfiltered, folks, isn't just about me, it's also about you. This is why we want this to be powered by the people. I want to thank Lee Saunders of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees for coming aboard as our first corporate underwriter. Their contribution has been vital to get us to this point today, and we look forward to a great partnership. And I can't wait to also share with you some of the other folks we're talking to once we finalize those deals. But when I say powered by the people, that also means you. Yes, we want you participating. This show won't require a cable subscription or be hidden behind a digital paywall. We'll initially live stream the show every day on Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube and make it available to everyone for free. You'll be able to watch it anytime on your phone, your tablet, computer, or television. This is truly a post-cable digital media show. That's why I'm also launching the hashtag Bring the Funk Fan Club, where our aim is for at least 20,000 of our supporters to contribute an average of $50 a year to ensure that we will be able to deliver the news and information you want and need that is independent. We have several funding levels for those who want to give more, and your support is vital. Now, we will have advertisers, but we have to be willing to fund our own news source if we want them to be free and independent and to speak to our issues with clarity and conviction. So right now, I want you to go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com, where you can join the Bring the Funk Fan Club and become a charter member. Now, of course, we're going to have various discounts and gifts for our charter members of the Bring the Funk Fan Club, and so we want all of you to sign up. And again, I've been saying this for years, that if we want our news, we are going to have to be able to fund it. So you can looking forward to, again, discounts to merchandise and books, as well as exclusive invites to various events that we put on around the country. Plus, your name will be listed on our website as a charter member. Why must we have an independent platform like Roland Martin Unfiltered? Because that is what has gotten us through all these years in America. It was 191 years ago when the nation's first black newspaper, Freedom's Journal, wrote in their lead editorial on March 16, 1827, "We wish to plead our own cause, too long have others spoken for us." Frederick Douglass, the former slave and great abolitionist who founded the North Star newspaper, said it was, quote, "just common sense that those who suffer injustice are those who must demand redress, and thus African-American authors, editors, and orators must have their own paper with which to share their voices." It was Douglass who inspired Robert Abbott, who went on to found the Chicago Defender in 1905, a groundbreaking newspaper that battled white supremacists and segregationists and spoke on behalf of millions of black Americans and led the great migration of black folks from the South to the North. It was the great Ida B. Wells Barnett who used the power of her pen to fight against lynching, even as she faced mobs who wanted her killed. But today we're seeing fewer voices of color in radio, television, and online media, not just on the air, but also owning. Here we stand 25 years away from the nation being a majority of people of color in 2043, and we're still depending on someone else to tell our story. That, folks, can never happen. We must always be in control of our narrative. Now is the time for us to speak truth to power. Now is the time for us to control our narrative and have a voice that represents our interests and our concerns. Now is the time to fight against fake news and the folks who wish to do our community harm. I want you to go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com for more details to become a charter member of the Bring the Funk fan club. And beginning September 4th, let's mark a new chapter for an independent news source that, in the words of the late, great Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, is unbought and unbossed.